Hello, I'm Tom Gosling, Executive Fellow at the European Corporate Governance Institute, and I'm here today with Albert Choi, the Paul G. Cowper Professor of Law at the University of Michigan Law School, to discuss his paper, Pricing Corporate Governance. Albert, thanks so much for taking the time to speak to me today.
It's a great pleasure to be here. Thank you so much for having me.
So your paper looks at the governance features of firms on IPO, which is a really topical issue given the large proportion of firms that IPO these days with features like staggered boards and dual class shares, which conventionally might be viewed as kind of quotes undesirable governance characteristics. But at the same time, a number of exchanges are following the US in making, for example, dual class share structures more accessible for firms at IPO, even in the face of some really quite fierce institutional owner resistance. And in your analysis, you show that when there are different types of governance structures that are optimal for different types of firms, and at the same time, when there's information asymmetry so that external investors don't know what type of firm they're dealing with, then you do end up with at least some firms opting for the suboptimal governance structure. And this is quite a nuanced analysis, and I'd really encourage viewers to read the paper, as we'll only be able to scratch the surface in this conversation. But can you give our viewers the gist of the argument?
Sure. Just to situate the paper a little bit more, I think the big question I was sort of trying to address is that I'm open to the possibility that a different governance structure is going to be optimal for different firms. So I'm not saying that the dual class is always bad or dual class is always good, or staggered board is always bad or always good. So there is going to be some matching process that has to happen. Staggered board and dual class and some of the other governance structures are going to be good for some firms, whereas they may be bad for some others. The big argument I'm sort of trying to wrestle with here is that some of the argument that has been advanced by various scholars and practitioners that, at least at the time of the IPO, the firms will actually have a very strong incentive to choose the optimal governance structure. And the reason is that if they are choosing a suboptimal governance structure, the market will quote unquote punish them. And then the amount of pricing and valuation that they're going to get at the IPO will be substantially lower. So that's the sort of the basic argument I'm sort of trying to wrestle with. And the paper is sort of trying to examine, okay, what are the conditions under which that argument will actually be true? And as you mentioned just a few minutes ago, two, I think, important conditions must be satisfied for that market to function well. One is that the investor should be aware which governance feature is optimal for which firm. So if they see a certain firm that's doing an IPO, do I know that for this firm, either dual class or the staggered board is optimal? And then the other is that not all, again, this is kind of going back to my premise earlier, is that not a single governance structure is optimal for across all firms. So there has to, again, be some sort of a matching. So only when those two conditions are satisfied, then we're actually going to have an IPO market functioning relatively well, so as to provide the market-based incentive to the firms to adopt the optimal governance structure.
And so your contention is that actually it's quite plausible that those conditions are not satisfied, and so actually you're going to get suboptimal outcomes. Can you maybe expand on that a bit?
Yeah, especially if you think about it, especially if you're thinking about an IPO, that's the time when the firm is offering its equity to the public for the first time. So you would expect that the informational problem between the public investors and then the insiders can be quite severe. Presumably the insiders, including the entrepreneur, pre-IPO shareholders, will know a lot more about the firm compared to the public investors. And then the only information that the public investors are getting are through these IPO documents, such as the registration statement and prospectus. So this is not a firm that has imagine a firm that is doing an IPO for the first time. So this is not a firm that has a long track record of public filings. So this is the firm that is going to the public for the first time. So that's sort of an informational problem one would expect to be quite severe, especially compared to the firm that has been trading on the market for a substantially long period. So that's why I'm quite skeptical
mm,
that the IPO market can
mm,
actually price these governance features
mm.
correctly.
Yeah, and I mean, it's certainly as well, your position would be supported by the fact that there's you kind of no real academic consensus on what governance structures work where, despite kind of decades of study on it. And so then we come to sort of remedies for this, and one remedy you discussed to this problem is a private ordering mechanism. And so this involves firms sending signals to the market about kind of what type of firm it is. How would this work, and what are some of the problems with that?
Yeah, I mean, this is sort of Michael Spence costly signaling sort of a mechanism that I kind of discussed in the paper.
Mm,
I try to focus on three different kinds. So one possibility is that if I really know that, let's say, dual class is optimal for me, and
mm,
then I want to actually send a very strong signal to the market. One possibility for me is to hire a very reputable, costly investment advisor or investment bank or lawyers or
mm,
accountants,
mm,
and then they can actually come through my operations or my governance structures and whatnot very carefully. And through them, I can actually send a costly signal to the market, the incredible signal to the market. Then hey, public investors, this dual class structure really is optimal for me, and then you should give us a better valuation at the IPO. Another possibility is to have a little bit more skin in the game in some sense. So one of the reasons why the firms are doing an IPO is to raise money through financing, and then using the money, they're going to sort of try to make investments into the future.
mm,
But by relying less on the public money, but relying more on the private money, so by investing their own money into these foregoing future projects, as an example, or future investment, that can actually send a signal, hey, I got a really big skin in the game here.
mm-hmm,
And then if I really don't have a strong trust that this is the optimal governance structure, I would not be doing this, as an
mm-hmm,
example.
mm-hmm,
So that could be another possible costly signal. And then the third, which is I think is also quite interesting, is a deliberate underpricing. So especially if I know that my size, the pie, or the total firm valuation is quite large,
mm,
then by deliberately underpricing, I can actually also again. So it's kind of again taking on that cost of underpricing.
mm,
That could be another sort of a mechanism
mm,
that let's say a good firm who really is let's say benefiting from dual class or staggered board can also send to the market
mm,
to signal as a credible signal to the market that they're actually adopting the ultimate governance structure.
mm, mm. So these mechanisms are sort of ex ante signaling mechanisms, but you also talk about a different remedy, which is kind of like an ex post liability system, so that investors can make claims if the firm was overvalued at IPO based on a suboptimal governance structure. And what are your views on that?
Yeah, I mean, another possibility is sort of an ex post mechanism, as you just mentioned. If for some reason, if the firm is really not adopting the optimal governance structure simply to get a better valuation at the IPO, in some sense, the firm is quote unquote misrepresenting to the public investors about what their optimal governance structure is and what they intend to do, for instance, with the proceeds. So in case there's a misstatement or omission of material information, at least within the United States, after the IPO, the investors can bring a lawsuit against the firm
Mm,
to recover compensatory damages. So this is known as the Section 11 liability. I also discussed the two problems associated. There are two problems associated with the Section 11 liability.
mm,
One is that in many circumstances, the type of information that let's say, the IPO firms are actually sending to the public investors are rather soft, quote unquote soft. So if you kind of go all the way back to the Google's IPO as an example, they say that they're adopting the dual class stock. And then the reason why they said that they're adopting the dual class stock is that they have this commitment to the long-term performance of the firm. I mean, if you think about that, who would actually say that I'm only committed to the short-term returns of the firm? Basically, all the firms will basically say that I'm actually
mm.
committed to the long-term performance of the
Yeah.
firm. And that's a really soft kind of information. So it's almost like a cheap talk. So in many cases, the information that is actually lacking from the public investor's perspective will be soft information, either through a misstatement or non-disclosure. And then, they're going to have a really hard time that they can actually bring a successful Section 11 claim. The other, which is also really sort of interesting, is that in many cases, the investors who are being hurt are the shareholders of the firm. So they actually have a residual claim on the firm. And then if they're sort of bringing a Section 11 claim against the firm, they are in some sense shooting themselves. They're actually kind of hurting themselves because once the firm pays a lot of damages as a compensation, then the total firm value is going to go down, I'm sorry. And then the shareholders who are now the plaintiffs in the Section 11 liability lawsuits will also suffer the reduction in firm value. So I also kind of talk about, so that is sort of in turn, reduces the incentive to bring a Section 11 claim. That all can also lead to under deterrence. Just as a sort of a marketing or advertising point, with a co-author of mine, Kathy Spear. This is also ECGI working paper. We sort of delve into the Section 11 liability issue much more in depth. It's called the liability for non-disclosure in equity financing.
And it's so it sounds like there's not a sort of magic solution to these problems around the IPO market. And I'd like to bring the discussion on this specifically to debate on dual class shares, because a number of institutional investors have really strong views on this and think they should be banned. The Council for Institutional Investors has broadly taken this position, and in the UK recently there was a consultation to allow firms with dual class share structures to list on the primary exchange, and there was a lot of disquiet amongst the institutional investor community. Well, what's your view on how we should be approaching this question of dual class shares on exchanges, given this strong difference in views? And what do you feel about the effectiveness of safeguards such as sunset provisions, which are what are most commonly kind of called upon as a safeguard?
Yeah, I mean, I must have to disappoint you in the sense that I don't really have a magic solution. In that sense, that this paper is a bit of a depressing paper because I don't really provide, okay, so this is the way we can actually solve this problem. I sort of kind of talk about the private ordering mechanism, some liability issues, and then towards the end of the paper, I also kind of talk about either mandatory or optional sunset provision. All those solutions will also come with certain kinds of inefficiencies or cost. If you kind of think about the mandatory sunset provision, what I talk about in the paper is that, okay, so if let's say all firms are required whenever they're going public with a dual class structure, if they all have to adopt the sunset provision that allows the public investors to undo the dual class structure several years, let's say, after the IPO. So what that might do is that could actually, quote unquote, cure inefficiencies ex post. But at the same time, this can even sort of enhance the ex ante inefficiency in the sense that now the entrepreneur, the pre-IPO shareholders who know that this ex post inefficiency will be cured through the undoing of the dual class structure might have an even stronger incentive to adopt the inefficient governance structure ex ante at the time of the IPO. I don't want to get into too much details through this. You can all you're more than welcome to take a look at the paper and then think about whether or not that argument actually holds up. And then on the what about then the optional sunset provision? So instead of sort of mandating all firms to adopt the sunset provision, maybe we can give an option to the firms to either opt in or opt out of the sunset provision. The problem with that, of course, so that's the private ordering approach. The private with the optional sunset provision, of course, is that we're sort of going all the way back to the initial problem. That kind of allows the firms to choose the either dual class or the single class structure or staggered or non-staggered board. Again, whatever the firm thinks that they can actually get a better valuation, then again, this is going to provide a lot of incentive to the firms to either adopt or discard a sunset provision. even though that may be inefficient, so as to get a better valuation at the IPO. So both of those mechanisms will also come with certain kind of costs. And as far as I can see, I'm not sure if there's really a magic solution here. This is a very complex problem, especially given a lot of the informational failures that we observe at IPO market. And I guess the bottom line I'm sort of trying to advance through the paper is that we cannot really sort of trust the market solution as to as to solving this governance structure issue.
But at the same time, I mean, what really struck me from your paper as well is that in an area where people often take quite strident views on either side of the argument, you've shown that there's actually a lot of nuance and complexity, and that actually, you know, there may just not be an easy way out of that market imperfection. It may just be something we need to live with to some degree.
I would completely agree with that. I mean, again, you know, this is a very complex problem, and I don't think that I would not take a stark view that the either geocluster or Steiger boards are always bad or they're always good. And then I again will not take the view that the market will always provide a proper solution to this issue. So this is, I think, a problem that we'll have to kind of think about for the long run.
Well, that's great, Albert. Thanks so much for sharing those thoughts with us today. Really fascinating paper and great discussion. Thank you.
Thank you so much for having me.